All right. Thanks everyone for taking the time on I think for most of you it's evening. Maybe some of you it's in the morning. Thanks so much for taking the time. I think just super excited to share on this topic. I think this is just kind of a bit more of a introductory session about DAOs. Kind of what we see in the space, what's the underlying technology around it, what's the fuss around it. I want to keep it fairly informal. So, keep it a fun session. I'm trying, if I use too many buzzwords, do call me out for it. Let's find ways to make DAOs accessible to everyone. I think that's the goal of Poko. And I think that's how we approach the spirit of this presentation. So I'm just going to spend like maybe 20 minutes walking through some slides, sharing a little bit about DAOs and the underlying technology powering it. And then I would love to turn it over to maybe some questions or a discussion. So I think first thing is just, why are DAOs interesting, right? I think if you look at the last 2-3 years, there's been an explosion in terms of DAOs, in terms of, number one, the growth in the assets being managed by DAOs. I think it's grown about 7-8x since about 2 years ago. In terms of the number of participants in DAOs, there's about 600,000-700,000 people now actively voting in DAOs. Governance tokens are held by about 4 million people. So overall in the last 2 years, we've seen a huge increase in this organization type. So I think super exciting. But I think there remains a lot of problems to making DAOs affordable and accessible to the average DAO creator. And I think that's one thing we want to go through to see how we can best help people demystify this whole process. I think before we talk about DAOs, there's a few things, as I mentioned before, it's meant to be a bit of an introductory session about this fascinating organization type. So we need to go through a few kind of key ideas, terminology, technologies in the space. And the first one being kind of like, what is Web3? So I'm sure all of you have heard the term Web3 being thrown around. Just very simple kind of explanation. If you think about Web 1, where most of us were passive consumers of content. So people put things on the internet, we read it. And that was the first version, the early version of the internet. And at some point, we moved to what we call Web 2. So, users create content, create information. Our activities are stored kind of digitally with a lot of platforms. And as a result of that, there was accumulation of data by major platforms. And as a result of the accumulation of data, many of these platforms have incredible power over us, right? So you think about Facebook, and at some point, when people look at Facebook, they think of it as like, hey, Facebook thought of it as a government in some sense, right? They have a court to make decisions around what gets published or what should not get published on Facebook. At some point, they're trying to create their own currency. But the idea is that because of the data accumulated in these platforms, they have incredible control over our lives. So think of it same way as like how a bank intermediates your relationship between you and the person you're trying to send money to. It goes through a bank, and through that process, as a platform, they have incredible power over how we live our lives. So that's kind of the Web 2 version of the internet. And we move to Web 3, where the idea is that because of decentralized networks, because of blockchain technology, we are able to have control over our own data. So the idea is that we not only read the data, we not only write the data, but this data sits in things like our own wallet address that we control. And because of that, we own it. So that is the version of Web3. And what it allows is basically a disintermediation of platforms. So, you look at the big startups of the past, you think of your PayPal, your Facebook, your Uber, your Airbnb, all of this requires centralized platforms that hold and control data, they control access, and they sit between us and the counterparties in a transaction or in an activity. And the idea and the dream behind like Bitcoin and Ethereum is to say, hey, can we are we able to do peer-to-peer transactions on the internet in a way that allows us to directly interact with each other without having this intermediary having that kind of control or access over our data, over our decisions. So I think that's the shift I think that we see with decentralization. And what powers this, what enables this to happen is essentially something called the blockchain. I'm guessing most of you are quite familiar with it now. But I remember kind of in the early days when when I used to give these talks back in like 2016, 2017, everyone was like arguing over like, oh, what's a blockchain? And then people hear some terms like proof of stake, proof of work, and start debating about, which is better or which is worse. But I think the underlying concept behind the blockchain is that I have a ledger, started with Bitcoin, and this ledger is something that's that achieves a consensus around data, around the activities that has happened, the state of things, through a decentralized protocol. So think of it as, say, like all of us here today, it's not saying like, Brandon or Benjamin has access to this database and he keys in there and say, okay, this is what has happened in the world today. Instead, there is a mechanism in which all of us agree that a certain event has happened. And what this then allows us to do is that I can then transfer kind of information on this ledger. I can say certain things have happened in a way that we can all agree on. And it's not a single party that kind of makes that decision. So this enables decentralization. And then, you have a separate innovation called smart contracts, which came about with the Ethereum blockchain. So, Bitcoin introduced to us the idea of internet money, right? The idea that if I am sending 1 Bitcoin from myself to, say, Ricardo on this call, I can prove that, all of us agree that Jeffrey has 1 Bitcoin less and Ricardo has 1 Bitcoin more. So I think that's the power of the blockchain. Ethereum basically came about with the idea that how do I take this concept of the decentralized approach to achieving consensus to computation, right? So I can execute programs on the blockchain, and we all agree that these are the rules under which it operates. It is transparent to all of us. And when it executes, we all agree that no one can tamper with this program. And this is the underlying technology of a DAO, because a DAO is essentially what you call a smart contract. And a smart contract is a piece of code that does certain computations. And this computations could be something like, say, if we agree that 10 of us say, please send money to Max, this is something that that will happen based on the rules that we have programmed in, and it's transparent, and we know that it's not something that can be changed by any individual party that controls the platform or the data. So I think that's the beauty of Ethereum, and most other types of blockchains essentially kind of does something very similar to what Ethereum does. I think moving on to, so I think kind of, those are the underlying technologies that enable DAOs. So DAOs are essentially smart contracts. These smart contracts are normally centered around something called a treasury. So it's a pool of capital, and there is a set of decisions and rules around those decisions that help us govern or control this treasury. So I think that's what we see as the core of a DAO. What are some examples of DAOs that we see a lot? So you have, kind of your common like protocol type DAOs. So they govern, say, a piece of technology. So some you might heard of, like, say, MakerDAI. So they basically have a protocol in which they say, how do we create stable coins and kind of deposit the collateral that enable those stable coins to perform as stable coins. So that's an example of a protocol DAO. We have seen a lot of community DAOs. So groups of people banding together to create a community around a common mission, a cause, a social club, a learning group. That's another very common type of DAO. We have seen non-profit DAOs where people raise money for a certain cause. and they want to pool funds together and make decisions together around kind of how the kind of decisions they'll make in terms of pursuing their mission. Then we've seen investment DAOs. I think that's a very common use case where people are buying things like, say, primary issuance of tokens, buying into a SAFE or a SAFT. So these are instruments to invest in startups, kind of like as a group. And they want to do it as a DAO because one is that they want to break down the amount that they have to invest in, and they want to collectively make decisions in ways that they can have confidence, vis-a-vis the other parties in a transaction. So that's some of the investment DAOs we've seen. And then we have also seen kind of more, I would say, not entirely decentralized. I think decentralized is often not the aim for actually a lot of people creating this kind of organizations, or at least not the decision-making part of it. But you've seen more like digital startups, especially from Latin America, where people say, oh, I want to distribute some of my ownership as tokens to my employees. I want to make a lot of payments on crypto rails. And I also need an entity to transact and interact with other business partners. So we've seen some of those startups to kind of create themselves as a startup. So just some examples of DAOs that we see out there, and always more interesting use cases that have been coming up every day. We actually just had, we have interested users on our wait list from every continent. And I can say that confidently now because 2 days ago, we had someone from basically an arts community in Antarctica approach us to create basically an Arctic DAO with the idea that they would contribute the art that they were creating to a treasury and use it to raise funds to fund promotion kind of around climate change, how we should deal with it, how we should understand it, and what we need to do to prevent it. So I think creating a DAO is often a very perplexing journey, right? There's a lot of components. We have a lot of people reach out to us and they'll be like, oh my God, like I have this idea, but where do I start? There's so many things to do. I go to my lawyers and it's super complicated. It's very expensive. And I think, we try to break down a bit how we generally see this journey that people embark on when they create their DAOs. So most DAOs are centered around a mission or a purpose. This could be collecting NFTs. They could be investing in startups. They could be investing in tokens, like primary tokens, issuance. It could be about building a product or funding a public good. So that's generally where it starts, right, with most of these things. Most of them honestly start as very informal organizations. Maybe it's a Telegram group, maybe it's a Discord server, maybe it's a WhatsApp channel, and it's maybe anywhere from 3, 4 people, 10 people, 20 people. They come together, and some of them are like, say, hey, I have access to this new cool project. They're issuing tokens. We need to buy in together because there's a minimum buy, and we'll sign a SAF with them, kind of an agreement to receive tokens in the future. They discuss, they say, hey, I think it's a great idea. We all contribute maybe 3, 4K in, and then they create a DAO. And it's kind of, in a sense, an informal organization. So that's where it starts. And at some point, people formalize some of this route. So taking that investment club, right? So one of this group in Canada, they were like 19 people. They want to invest in tokens. They want to invest in equity in startup. And they start with a small group. They trust each other, and they just generally kind of like say, hey, one of us will sign the contract, or we'll just make decisions by consensus on our group. At some point, they say, hey, I want to grow that 19 members to 100 members. And I need to formalize governance. I need to be able to say, how do we make decisions together? And they basically kind of write out maybe a charter for the DAO that explains how they're going to make those decisions. At some point, they say, hey, in order to function as a DAO, right? Very often what a DAO does is that they will issue tokens. These tokens are tied to governance of the DAO. We actually do work to issue other kinds of tokens in a legal manner. But they generally say, oh, the 19 members of us, we're all going to receive a token. This could be an NFT, this could be a fungible token, but this token gives me access to my community. It gives me voting rights, and it allows me to interoperate with a lot of other Web3 applications out there. So at some point they say, I'll issue a token, and sometimes they use that token to raise funds. Those funds goes into something called a treasury. So I mentioned at the start of this presentation that very often at the core of a DAO is you have a treasury and you have a smart contract that governs the treasury. So it basically sets the rules for how people can use the treasury. And people use it to make payments, to raise funds, to issue new tokens in the same way that you maybe would use something like a bank account. And then this kind of goes and supports a bunch of projects. Legal wrappers. I don't know if people have heard the term legal wrappers and DAOs. It's a fairly new concept, but one that we see as very, very important today. So Andreessen Horowitz, one of the largest venture capital firm, has came out saying that, we believe all DAOs should be filing legal papers and existing as legal entity. Some people say, hey, as a DAO, like I should not be regulated. It's centralization. There is that debate that's going on. So what's the problem here? So I think the concern people have with not incorporating a DAO is that one is that obviously, for a lot of the purposes of a DAO, right? Say I'm a startup DAO, or I'm a foundation, or I'm an investment club. I maybe need to own assets. I need to rent a building. I need to sign contracts. For all of this, you need a legal form to do it, because people may not recognize a DAO as a legal entity. And then you might have to have one person of the DAO to go sign the contract. And then you have all these issues around trust and liability for the individual involved. The second issue that comes up is this question of unlimited liability. So, if there's a court case in California now, where they're saying that the DAO management was negligent, and they're saying because they are not incorporated as an entity with limited liability, the individuals that make those decisions are liable as general partners. So they have unlimited liability. So their personal assets have to be used if they are found to be negligent to pay off the debts of the enterprise that they're involved in. So that's very risky for DAO participants. Then there's a question of lack of tax clarity. So some people say, hey, I never incorporated, as a DAO, I don't have to pay any taxes. I think the unfortunate news is that governments do find ways to go after you, regardless of whether you incorporate or not, especially if you're making money. And so sometimes it's better to have a tax base, a place where you are tax resident in, that gives you clarity around what the rules under which you operate, so you don't suddenly wake up one morning with a massive tax bill that you just never knew you were on the hook for before. And the last part is that, DAOs, like most entities, will get into, as they interact with other parties, as they interact with the real world, they will get into disputes. Not all those disputes can be resolved on-chain in an automated manner, and they will still need access to some sort of legal-based dispute resolution. So, we believe there are good reasons why DAOs should be incorporated. The options today, unfortunately, tend to be very complex, very complicated, and I think unnecessarily expensive. And I think that's one thing that we try to resolve with the solution we're providing, right? We believe DAOs should have a legal wrapper, and it should be affordable and accessible. So what are the options that we see most commonly used today? People create a US-based company, normally in Delaware. The challenge for that is that the security issuance in the US, when you issue tokens, it can very easily be construed as securities, and that creates a lot of legal risk for the entity and the participants involved in it. And then if you have participants from around the world, which hopefully your DAO will be inclusive and will do that, for some of the members outside of the US, there are tax implications that could make it fairly complicated for them to participate in such an entity. Some people create what you call a Cayman memberless foundation. This is normally done in conjunction with a BVI entity or some other entity that issues the tokens. So the reason why people do this is because in Cayman, there is something called a memberless foundation. And it's given a mission. The DAO, the tokens are linked to the foundation through some sort of governance rights. But because of VASP regulations in Cayman, the entity itself cannot issue the tokens. So normally you have to set up multiple entities. Generally, at present state, it is very expensive to issue and to manage these different entities. And the last one is you create an offshore special purpose vehicle. I mentioned before, people use like Panama, BVI to issue this kind of tokens. So this is just legal wrappers and something you might have heard about. So I think just coming to the end of the formal presentation, why use a DAO? I think trustless collaboration is a goal. At present, the technology is still moving towards it. A lot of the execution of decisions of governance is still not done in an autonomous manner, the A in the word DAO. But I think before we get there, there's a lot of things the DAO does that already enables this collaboration. So take an example. If I'm in Argentina or I'm in Vietnam or some other country, and you give me an option in a company, it might not mean very much to a lot of individuals. But if I have a token, the token has a relationship with the entity, and you have moved the token into my wallet, what we see is that people kind of have a certain sense of ownership and a trust that they attribute to having that digital asset sit in under their individual wallets and control. So it's just a very minor point just to illustrate how trustless collaboration is being done using this kind of Web3 architecture and format. So we see tokens very much as the foundation for plugging a company into the Web3 ecosystem. So what do people use tokens for? One is to govern member entry and exit into a group. So now it's like if I want to give someone ownership in some way, it's can be quite complicated. So I use tokens as a way to gate that access. It allows us to transfer ownership of digital asset rights in a straightforward manner that people understand, and it's fairly low friction and low cost vis-a-vis kind of other more traditional paper-based methods that you sometimes have to go to a lawyer, you have to draft out an agreement, you have to get parties to sign it. It provides an easy way for us and a common standard in which we can operate on. I mentioned, token gated collaborations. So with tokens, there's a lot of applications that people are building that uses tokens as a basis for accessing those applications. So, these tokens become a way of using all those applications and to plugging again the company into Web3. And collective decision making, right? So, as you mentioned, one of the key features of a DAO is the ability to use tokens to vote and to make those decisions together. So it's important to have this as part of the company architecture. And I think what is it enabling? One is a governance mechanism for us to manage digital assets in common, and sometimes, with a legal form, off-chain assets. Decisions can be made using tokens with kind of the right design and smart contract in place. Transparent decision making. I think a lot of these organizations, there is transparency. People know what's happening. They know where transfers are being made. From a UX perspective, not always the most accessible today, but there is a way to track all of this that is much more open than traditional organizations. Fundraising is a very, very big part. where people are issuing tokens and tapping the Web3 ecosystem or financial ecosystem in various ways through decentralized exchange, centralized exchanges, or just kind of a system to kind of work with a small group of friends, but pooling their money in a way that they can do it fairly easily across borders. And I think some of the things that are very interesting in terms of just new models that arise as a result of this is one, new go-to-market mechanisms. So you've seen, for example, a lot of people say, hey, I want my early users to own the platform I'm building. And they distribute this ownership in a very cost-efficient manner using tokens to a large group of people with the idea that they want to involve them in building the organization and getting rewarded for doing so. So it's a new way of going to market. And the last one is there are also new ways of rewarding effort with ownership. So I'm involved with a number of DAOs where they say, hey, I need someone to do due diligence on this investment that's coming in on the founder. If anyone has good references for the person, I will give you X number of tokens for your contribution to the community. So we've seen some of them do that too. Yep. So I think just bringing it to an end before maybe going to the questions, do feel free to use the chat or later Lan will help moderate the discussion. I think just to kind of share again what Poko does. We are providing a DAO creation and management software where it's a DAO in a box model with a legal wrapper. And the reason, we explain why we think a legal form is important. And we want to make setting up this, in a sense, legal entity DAO with a smart contract in a way that's affordable and accessible. And accessible to us means that you don't have to go muck around with like a lot of different tools to do the key things that you need to do to get set up and to manage your DAO entity. It should be affordable. Currently, there's a lot of legal engineering being done to make a DAO happen. The reason being that DAO legislation doesn't really exist in almost all jurisdictions. So it's complicated. No one knows how it should be done. So we're trying to create a simplified model that does that. And we actually work with a special economic zone that's given us permission to create legal DAO entities and are iterating on their regulation to make DAOs a more, I would say, compliant and a more accessible format. And you can, this DAO in a box setup allows you to do your governance, manage your treasury, issue your tokens, as well as kind of create the legal entity. And then people are able to vote on certain decisions or proposals, and these are recorded on the blockchain. And down the road, we will make the decisions more autonomous. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what Poko does. And I think just some exciting news is that we are preparing to launch a private beta version of our product. It's going to be on the testnet at the end of this month. And along with it, we are working with our government partners to issue the first 100 legal entities for DAOs in an economic zone. So what that means is that you'll be able to also create a proper legal entity along with the DAO, and that entity will be synchronized with your tokens and your smart contract governance mechanism. So please do sign up and test our product and give us amazing feedback. Thanks.